one of the themes that we keep seeing as we navigate our own losses is that our society tends to have like an unspoken timeline or expectation how we're going to move through those losses. And the truth is that grief is a deeply personal thing with a process and a flow that can be unique to each of us. And when we have those pressures, sometimes, those pressures saying that the way you're grieving is not the right way, we can sometimes wondering if maybe everyone's right and the way we're grieving isn't the right way. And so we're going to talk about how we can redefine grief so that we can grieve on our own terms and use it as a tool for healing and moving us in the direction that we need to move in rather than looking to um, being distracted from our healing by those who say that we're not doing it right. So I'm going to get this conversation started by asking Jody a question. So, like, why do you think so many of us feel pressure to grieve a certain way?
Mm, I think, growing up, many of us have had a tendency to compare ourselves to other people, right? Like I want to look like them. I want to dress like them. Maybe I want to act like them. So when we've grown up with this and then you take that and you're relating it to grief, it's like, ooh, what happens when I don't measure up to the expectations that I have when I'm striving for something else? And so when I think we acknowledge that we might not be measuring up or we have that comparison factor, we start to fake it a little bit or we pretend or we start to question ourselves about, well, why can they do it and we're not? And so, when we have, in adolescence, I see this in my teenager all the time, right? And so we're kind of grown up this way. And so you're coupling the social expectations that you have of yourself and the comparison with often a feeling of not wanting to burden other people with your stuff. And so we have a desire to prove ourselves that we're capable and we're competent to do all of these things. And so when you have that comparison and that desire to please and not burden other people, things start to cloud the way that you see yourself. And so I'll take you back to my personal experience. So I lost my husband about 17 years ago in the line of duty when I was home with Alexis, who was 8 months old. And at the beginning, while I was in that shock period of my life, the support was overwhelming, right? People were reaching out regularly, they were dropping off food, they were stopping by. But just as I actually started to come out of the shock, that's when the active support started to decrease. So when I was actually able to step into having conversations with people, I found that they weren't there in the way that I needed them to be. And so when I came up and I looked for some air, I saw a bunch of people way ahead of me. And I was like, I don't know how to catch up. Right. And so it's like, do I or how do I? And so I found myself kind of having two personas, right? The public facing one where I was trying to show that I was okay in order to meet the expectations of others. And then the one that I had inside of my house when things really weren't, when I was able to actually sit with myself. But the longer I tried to maintain those two different people, the less capable I was to access my authentic feelings. And I think it's from that place where people can get really confused. And so it's when you're not able to access those feelings that it really makes stepping into the healing process more difficult and delayed. And so that's kind of why I feel like those were the factors, at least for me, that I found really difficult in trying to navigate my early days of grief. Keegan, what do you think?
Yeah, a couple things that came up for me, like when sharing like like the last part, like delayed, like how this grief is like, well, there's a timestamp for grieving a certain way. And like this mask that where it's like, oh, I'm in this place that it needs to be done now and needs to be done in this like sequential order of like, well, this is where I'm at in grief. I just lost somebody. now I need to go through the sad part. Now I need to go through this depressed part. And like these stages of grief that have been like traditionally, these are the five things that you have to do in order to grieve a certain way. And I find that part is, it's not putting, like, it's not attesting to how humans actually function in that emotional or the cognitive state. So people are feeling like they have to put that mask on. It's just like,
Mhm.
oh, I don't know really know what grieving actually means, but I think I should be sad right now, but I also have to go to work today. So how do I balance all of these pieces of myself? And that just part of like how to, like where do we look? We look at the generations before us. We look at our parents, we look at our grandparents, we look at social media. It's like, how are they grieving this part? And even if it doesn't feel good for us, we still feel this need to align with that external voice of being like, hey, this is the way that things are doing and or people are grieving. And if I don't do that, then there's something wrong with me. So
Mhm.
all of a sudden now we have this, we're not enough, we're not even grieving enough for ourselves to feel aligned with who we actually are. And I think that's why this grief a certain way is, am I doing it right? What is the right process? And how do I maintain some type of like develop personal development so that I don't feel as othered in society or within my family dynamic and I'm lesser than because I'm not grieving the proper way. And it's all too, yeah, all too happens all too often.
Mhm.
Do you think that there's another side to this as well, where you're moving through grief in your own way, on your own terms, but the message that you're getting is that, oh, you really should have, like, you're still upset about that? It's been a lot of years though. It's been a long time. Are you still, or especially you mentioned, you have to go to work, you have to be productive, and um, people wondering if I- it's hard to give ourselves grace when when we're not receiving that grace, when that message isn't being reinforced outside. And yeah, I'm just wondering if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, and for me, what comes up is that time piece of when is it that we're needing to do, where are we within our cycle of grief that is asking us to be in these different parts of ourselves, these different parts of community or relationship. Um, and that's there's no time. There's no like grief is a forever process. We're not ever done grieving. It's something that we continuously do all the time. And I think that's one of the myths I find with the grieving process. It's like, oh, I've grieved. It's been a couple of years. I'm done. It's like, oh no, like grief is a system or a pattern that lasts for your entire period of time. Like it's not like the grief gets any harder to carry, but we get better at carrying it. And provided that space and tools and community, we're able to allow a fluidity within our days that are easier because we've developed the capacity to hold that grief process with a with that reverence and with that honoring of those who are no longer with us. And I think that's a really, for me, that's a really poignant part of like the myth around grief because it was like when in my grief story, it was a couple of years and I'm like, oh, I'm still feeling like sad and like this, my friend's gone and I don't know what to do. I'm like, why am I still missing him? And a mentor of mine at the time was like, hey, like I think you're underestimating yourself here. Like grief is you'll have grief forever. Like grief is going to be around for your entire life. And although it still hurts, we just get better at handling it. And that's something that's really changed my perspective on grief. It's like, oh, it's not a finish line. It's not something to get to. It's something that we continuously evolve with and into. And yeah, I'd love to hear what you have to say about that, Jody.
Yeah, no, I love it's I think all too often people want to fix you. Fix it. We've moved on. And you don't. You muddle through. You move through and you learn how to carry it differently. And some days the weight's a lot heavier than others, depending on what resources you have accessible and the other things that are going on in your life. And knowing that it is ever evolving and it's always healing, that's allowed to give, that's that idea has allowed me to be more compassionate with myself over the years. And that's what I don't think a lot of people are able to do at the beginning is exercise self-compassion. And Kendra, you talked about giving grace, right? Giving grace to other people, but almost more importantly, giving it to you yourself as you're moving through, how you're moving through. It's just so, so important.
And you both talked about how over time you can carry it differently, but I think it's important to know that it's not this kind of a chart where it's this. Definitely.
Yeah.
Um, and so, you could have been carrying it in a way that feels different or easier yesterday, but something happened today and it's brought you right back. And I
Mm-hmm.
think we need to normalize that that's okay and that's expected. And if we make space for that, then then it's easier for us to show compassion for ourselves and for other people who, you don't know where people are at and what they're carrying that day when you interact.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So then, uh, what are some signs then that we might be suppressing the way that we express grief instead of processing it authentically? Or what happens when we don't process it authentically? Like, is that even important? Maybe we'll start with that part. Is it important for us to process it authentically? Why? Why should
Yeah. And I think like the authenticity piece is so challenging. Like you were saying too, like the uniqueness of the grief process, it's completely different for everybody and based upon what you're exposed to when you're a child, based upon what you think is acceptable during those times. Like there's so many different facets of that grief process that makes it a unique, complex journey for whoever is going through that. And it is going to look differently. The authenticity piece comes in when we're needing to feel what is going on within our system, like whether it be thought patterns or emotion patterns or physical patterns, like that feeling is needing to be felt. Because if we start suppressing and ignoring those parts, then we'll have physical pains. Like, so in some schools of thought, grief is in the lungs and it's held in the heart. And there's certain parts of our anatomical system where grief is actually, it's it's held in the body. And if we ignore these signs of grief, we're going to have troubles with digestion or respiratory or our throat. We're having a hard time communicating. Like there's these energetic representations of what grief looks like. And more tangibly, like it's relationships. It's pulling, like when we're pulling ourselves away from social situations. We're having trouble time with or troubles with memory, thoughts, sleep patterns. There's all these certain parts that can create within our system, either internally or in our immediate, family or social networks, because we're suppressing. We stop feeling ourselves and we start turning our body offline. And when we start distracting ourselves from these components or we start avoiding these parts of experience, there's going to be consequence to that. And I think that's where the really tricky part is because sometimes like, oh no, I'm fine. We're doing the things it's okay. And because of that, we're ignoring parts of ourselves. We're turning those offline, which make it then harder for us to support ourselves and harder for us to communicate what support we're needing from others. So it's this like very meticulous back and forth that we're not communicating with ourselves, therefore we can't communicate with others, therefore we're not able to receive the support that we're needing. So it all becomes very like stagnated and stuck within these different parts of ourselves. So the authenticity piece is it's huge.
Mm. The three of us, we were talking the other day, and the idea of, the wisdom that our emotions have for us, and how listening to the truth in there can be, um, it tells us that, what, we need to lean into this thing and take care of it, pay attention. Because, like you say, Keegan, our bodies are a system um, that will suffer if we don't. What do you think, Jody?
Well, I made a couple of notes as you were talking about, when the memory, and I wrote down fog. Like there is a fog that people who are grieving It has been researched, and I have felt it, and I have existed in it. And you, when you're in it, you might know you're a little cloudy, but until you get out of it, you don't know how thick that was and how much it was impacting your day to day. And I found for me, the longer I was in the fog, or the more I ignored and tried to keep those two personas going, the fog didn't lift. And it was only once I was able to start to access more of my feelings authentically that I was able to have a little bit more clarity, right? And it's like, oh, I feel a little bit lighter. I can see a little bit more. And then you have a little bit of a relief. And then you want to step into what is it that I'm doing that's allowing this fog to dissipate. And so I want to do that more. And so all of those things are helping with your mind and your body. And so, like, self-care during grief is so critical, but it's often hard for people to access, right? And so it's how are we able to give ourselves what we need when we need it. And to your point about being able to articulate that to somebody else, that's when we give ourselves permission to be supported in a way that's actually helpful.
And we have a raised hand. And so I think that Edidayo is looking to ask us a question. Um, shall I allow him to talk so that he can ask us the question that he has?
Sure.
Okay. Are you ready, Edidayo? I'm going to allow you to talk. There you go. Oh, I'm going to unmute you. You have to unmute yourself. It's just connecting to audio. Technology helps us to go faster, but sometimes it helps us to go slower.
Slow is welcome.
And sometimes necessary, right?
Absolutely. So the connection is still, like, the audio is still connecting, so we'll give some time for that. In the meantime, uh, I see that we have another question. It says, in the grief process, is it where feelings arise at moments when... So I'm going to try and decipher what, because there's a bit of a... So in the grief process, is it where feelings arise at moments when wisdom could be welcome? Um, maybe you could just clarify your question a little. I'm not sure if you wanted to know, like, when, where, how we see wisdom, or how we identify when the feelings are carrying wisdom, or not sure.
And for me, that brought up when Jody, when you were talking about the fog. Fog dissipates a little bit, and like when those pieces that have been gone are welcome back as wisdom. And that's like when that light comes that you're talking about that I found, like this is how I'm interpreting it. Like the pieces that were like missed, that were within that darkness, start to be uncovered through that veil or through that darkness. And I think that's where those pain points are as well. Like it's just like those little bits of light, and sometimes we need to sink into that fog or be lifted from the fog in order to see the lights, and then we have something to follow.
Yeah.
And that's when it comes with stillness, like stillness, soothing, comfort, security, and like those parts of us that feel like we're meant to be in that space and time, and allowing that non-judgment, compassionate to be like, okay, here I am. What do I have to be learning in this situation? What do I have to be gleaning in this situation? Those little nuggets of light are the ones to follow so we can remove ourselves from the inevitable darkness that's been encompassing us from the loss that we're experiencing.
Yeah. And I don't think a lot of people have the awareness to know how to do that and how to look for those things in those moments. Right. And I think Kendra, maybe I think the person in the chat has added some clarification around that. And I think it might be speaking to exactly what Keegan was saying.
Yeah. How it's easy, like it's sometimes we miss the wisdom in the grief.
Yeah. Yeah. We're not ready to hear it yet. And that's the pain part, right? And I was saying, when I spoke with you last week, for me, the 4 month mark was the most painful of my journey. And that's because I had come up a little bit for air. And then I was starting to be able to tap into a little bit more authenticity in order to start to sit with the pain a little bit more. Because before that, I was either distracting, ignoring, just dealing with the physiological shock of it all. Right. And it wasn't until I was able to kind of get to not to the root, because we know what the root is, but what am I trying to say? Just get to that level of acknowledgement before I could start to access other emotions.
Mm.
Um, okay. Let's see here. So, Adideo, perhaps you could type your question in, and then that way we'll still get to hear from you because your audio doesn't seem to want to connect. Um, all right. So um, we have another comment from Corrine. She says, the
Mhm.
fog is real. And when you're in that stage, you can't remember any wisdom that you've heard,
Yeah.
and you're not processing things in the same way.
It's true. And I would say, Corinne, I felt that too. I started journaling early on to one, remember, I dreamt a lot after Chris died. So I would wake up and I would write that all in the journal, what I had dreamt about, so I wouldn't forget it. And then just different things as I was processing things. And it's an interesting exercise to go back to the early days of those journals and look to see where I was, what I was thinking, how I was interpreting the world, and then seeing where I am now. But sometimes writing things down when you're in that fog, so you have a record, I found really helpful.
Yeah, and then writing and physically writing as well. Like when we're actually writing with our like a pen and paper, it stimulates both sides of our brain. So it brings in like the creative and the processing at the same time. So it actually helps work through those processes. And I resonate deeply with like the fog. When we're in that state, we're unable to capture like what the essence was of the person that was with us, or who, like, our connection with them, because I find at that time there's so much pain for our own being that we're almost needing to tend to our own needs or tend to our own inner garden before we have access to the lessons and teachings that were gleaned from the person who's no longer with us. There's still so much pain and shock factor with our own being. So it's like, okay, like how is my physical body and my emotional state? What am I currently needing in order to feel safe enough in order to explore these different parts of our stories? And the wisdoms, they may have the opportunity to come back if we're able to maintain this progression. And the progression might be one word a day. It might be a paragraph a day, or it might be a page a day, but it's movement through that emotional and thought process that allows us to have some sort of movement to one day have this, like, these wisdoms kind of coming back. But again, that stagnancy, if we stay, we know what's going to be there, and it's the pain, it's the suffering, it's the challenge that's there. So any movement is welcome. So gives us an opportunity to step into this next place of being, even though we may not know where that next place of being is.
And I would offer that the pain of where you are has a lot of wisdom. Wherever you are, the wisdom is there because that the emotion of where you are, the truth of where you are and who you are in that moment, is not something that you can escape. You can cover it, you can ignore it, you can avoid it, but um, that doesn't make it less there.
Yeah, that's so true, Kendra. You're alluding to this before too, and like having this emotional connection. The emotions are there to support communication. Like that's what emotions, like the biological part of emotion, is to communicate with ourselves and communicate with others. And all these emotions, whether it be pain or sadness or anger, like they're serving a purpose. They're letting us know, specifically with sadness, that we've lost something that we've really cared about. Anger, that there's this injustice of that thing being taken from us, and like, and that there's so much wisdom within those emotions. And going back to our start of the conversation, how like these emotions have been like outcasted as bad. It's like, oh, you can't be mad, or you can't be sad, or like it's not proper to be like that. And it's allowing ourselves to experience and embody these emotions because it's our body's way of talking to us. And that's so beautiful if we're able to sit in that. And all too often we feel that pressure to escape from those really like nasty feelings, that there, if we zoom out enough, there are no bad feelings. They're just communicating what you're currently needing and what the next step might include.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, I like that very much. Kim asking, we have a question. What is the best way or conversation starter to help support someone as they are navigating grief, especially when there are occasions or reminders that make the emotions of grief most felt?
Mm.
I'll take that one to start. When we're supporting someone else, much of the time it's just being there that is the best thing that can be done, because words aren't going to take the pain away. And so if you have a well-crafted question, and it's just like, letting the other person know that you're genuinely ready to hear what they have to say, can be so liberating for the person who's grieving, because they don't know necessarily if you're asking them like, are they okay? Or, I'm here for you right now. What would you like to tell me? Or what would you like to share? And then just listening. Now, when it comes to special occasions and reminders, for me, it was the anticipation of those days that were actually worse than the day itself. Because again, I would find myself going back into, well, what's expected of me? I don't know how I'm going to react. I don't know what to do, or who to reach out to, or do I not want to celebrate anything at all? Does that make me a bad um, you know, family member if I just want to do something quietly instead of having something big? So the second guessing that is coming with these things. So I guess I've talked about me, what I experienced, but Keegan, what would you have to add?
Yeah, and for working with individuals with really challenging emotions, or working with like it just holding, it's holding space, like the grief, that there's a lot that's going on. There's a profundity of like emotion that we don't know what type of reaction we're going to be getting from an individual that certain day. Like there could be something that's activating them at the party. There could be something that's going on beforehand. We don't know exactly how to support. And I think that's where the answer is. Like, there's no right way to support because we don't know what the other person is going through. So sitting with them, like you were saying, Joe, is just like giving them time. It's like, hey, like I'm here, like I'm here with you. And providing those open-ended invitations to just allow them to exist however they need to exist. How have things been? Is there anything that I can do? I'm here with you if you need anything, and offering like providing them the opportunity to reach out and take some of these guidances or these offerings rather than trying to impose care. Because sometimes when we're in an event and we're just putting a face on, it's like, I just need to be here and this is what I need to be, and I'm going to be okay today. And when people offer that support, it's like I'm not in a supportive, like I'm not in a welcoming or invitation. Like I'm not in the situation that I'm able to greet that support. Even if somebody was offering it to me, like I'm not in the state that that's welcome right now. So I think for in those circumstances, just offering like, hey, I'm here when you're ready to talk would be a great place to start.
Mm. I'd offer that that's a great place to start, but sometimes, and I want your insight on this, sometimes when we're really in our grief, we it's a lot of work to think through what we need and then to articulate that to someone and to then to pick up the phone and call and say, all of the things. It can feel like a lot to do. And just because you're not in a place where you can articulate all that doesn't mean that you don't need some support. So, um, what I've seen, and I want to hear what you think of this, what I've seen is it's important um, to listen openly. So when you and not just to listen with your ears, listen with what you're seeing, what you know of that person and the relationship that you've built over the years. Are they do they seem well? Do they seem like they're getting basic nourishment, have they stopped reaching out in the way they normally would? And they likely have. But um, sometimes reaching out, someone seeing that you've reached out, even if you would rather not engage at that moment, it's better sometimes to be able to see someone coming without uh, expectation. You don't go to someone with expectation of the outcome, but to see someone coming without an expectation for the outcome, and to know that their offer of company, of care is there. Even if you say no to that, it's nicer to have to say no to that than it is to sit and need it and not have it, especially if it comes from a place of love without expectation attached to it. What do you
Okay.
think of that?
Yeah. Yeah. And as you're sharing that, there is like this nonverbal, like like this the somatic part of like the grieving process of like people kind of shutting down. You know the people that you love and like where their eyes are going or where they're how they're holding their body and how much just a hand on the shoulder or hand on the back. It's like, hey, like I see you, and having that invitation and where where is that going? Where does that need to where does that invitation need to be in like whatever capacity that you have as well? Like we want to make sure that the person offering support and care are in a condition or in a circumstance that is able to hold space for them and whatever that looks like. And yeah, Jod, I would love to hear what you have to say about that too in your experience of seeing like what does that greet look like? What is that? What are those specific questions that were either like averse, so like they were like kind of like, oh, I don't, that's too much, and what was like, oh, I wish this person was able to hold me in this space.
Mhm. I just found very quickly, I was able to identify who had experienced loss before. And it was mostly the ones, it wasn't what they said, it was what they didn't say. And so they were the ones that just continued to show up, and if I said no, they'd come back the next week and the week after, and they knew that you were going to need that ongoing support as opposed to the ones who kind of just were there for the first little while. Um, and it really, for me, depending on the level of the relationship, right? I felt more comfortable sharing with certain people than others. But there were times where I would find myself in the grocery store talking with someone who I did not have a close relationship with, that I was more open and honest with than some of the people that were coming, like from my family, for an example, right? Because I didn't feel like they would judge me. And that whole reason why I wasn't being authentic with, let's say, my mom, like my mom and I I found it very difficult to be authentic with my mom because she was leaning into God has a plan, everything happens for a reason, and I was having none of it. I could not at that moment listen to that with any level of acceptance. And so it provided a bit of a wedge for us. And I wanted to distance myself from that. So when I was able to find people who I didn't feel like they had an expectation of how I was moving through the world, those are the ones that I kind of clung to for that level of support. And who those people were surprised me sometimes.
You know what I think is beautiful about that Jody, is that it reminds us that community, we can create community in unusual spaces in ways that we don't anticipate, and that we can trust that the community is there if we're wanting to build that, and if we're open
Mm-hmm.
to building that. And it doesn't always have to be with in the same community that you had before.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that attunement piece, I think, is a really big part of community. It's like it's maybe not like what needs to be said, but it's what needs to be felt. And I think that's such a beautiful part of what having these conversations around grief and creating these communities is because it's the things that go unsaid that mean the most. It's the respect and honoring. It's like, yes, I see you. And it's the aura that we are bringing to those relationships and to those individuals that we feel like people in the grocery store coming up to us. It's just, I feel this individual. I feel like that I feel myself in them, and like that having that vulnerability and that authenticity within that grief process, and creating your community, creating your like your grief family, your grief supports. And who is that? And it may not be your direct family or your closest friend. It's the people who have experienced similar circumstances, like-minded individuals who know what it like genuinely feels like, rather than thinking and knowing what it looks like. It's such a unique dance, but it's so when we feel it, like we all know what that sense is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So we have a question in the chat asking how we can manage the people around us while we're grieving.
Mm. How we can manage the people around us.
The question says there was mention of a duality of dealing with your grief and also managing the people around us, which is so true. It adds to the weight of grief. What have you found effective when managing people around you while you're grieving? And Jody, that reminds me of a story you told me about how when Chris first passed and all the people coming up to you, so they wanted comfort from
Mm-hmm.
you around this
Yes.
loss, and it wasn't a resource that you had a lot to give, you know. And how do we as we move through
Yeah.
navigate grief, how do we manage the people around us?
Yeah, I think, you talk about that story. And so my husband, it was a very public event. There was thousands of people that came to the wake. And as I was greeting these people, it's like I needed to comfort them. And so I went right back into my waitress hospitality mode, and I thanked them for coming, and I told them where the sandwiches were. And so it was like I was playing this role. Here again, though, this is shock and what you're not able to process things. And then, fast forward a little while, I was not as polite. I found that all of I was shutting down. And with that, my filter left. I was very blunt and direct with people about what I needed or where I wanted them. And then you get into a little bit more healing, and you're able to access a little bit more humility and humanity when it comes to the engagement with other people. And so, all to say, depending on where I was along that healing journey, how I engaged with people shifted. And so what I found the most helpful when I was able to access, that more rational, better part of my brain, was to say things like, I'm really tired right now. I don't have the capacity to engage in this conversation if it was something that I didn't want. Or when it was with my blood family, saying, this is what I need right now. Once I was able to access and actually determine what it was that I needed in order to be able to articulate it to them in an honest way. And so we talk about feeling authentically, but I think the next step for that is actually speaking authentically. So saying what you mean and asking for what you need. And that is the best approach that I've had because I can't actually manage the people around me. I don't have any control over what they're going to do. I'm just able to tell them what I need.
Mhm.
And so that's kind of the posture that for this question, I would say if you can state what you are feeling and what you need in that moment, that's the best way to have your needs met in order for you to exist in whatever circumstances you find yourself in.
Mm.
It's
Yeah.
so true that we can't control anything about anybody except ourselves. And so, yes, Keegan, what were you going to add?
Yeah, and I think that like beautifully said, Jody. And I think a part where what came up for me is we're not able to control the others. Like that's not something that we're able to do, or their capacity and like being there for us. And that's where I find the community, like find your people, like find the people who you are able to be vulnerable with and allow those supports to be like your hearthstones or your tethering. So it becomes easier to allow yourself to put those boundaries up with the people that are coworkers or colleagues or family members who may not be at the space to have that support. So yeah, and you're still able to receive that type of reprieve and rest and relax possibly, or at least that debrief with a close-knit community. Because we're still needing to talk about these parts of ourselves and have that connection piece. And I think that it's connecting with the right people
Mm,
and the ones who are seeing us for who we are and where we are, opposed to the ones that we should be talking with or the ones that we should be connecting with and should feel comfortable. Like there's go with what where your heart feels comfortable and safe, opposed to what the demands of others of like, let's go for dinner, let's go for this. And like, that's, you know what, I have my people right now. Thank you so much. And I'm just going to take some time for myself. And that comes back to that compassion, come back to that care, and come back to that soothing.
yeah. And the importance of what you're saying in that, I'm hearing boundaries.
Mm.
Right? When we're able to establish boundaries, that's actually going to really help us with our well-being and our wellness and not just in grief, but in every other aspect of your life as well.
So, Keegan, you were talking a little bit about community, and I think we'll have the last question, which is, what part does community play in the healing process?
Yeah, and that's a big one for me. Community is it is the most important part of my self-care. Like that is the part where I feel most seen and heard and supported. And it took me a long time to find my community. And the community provides space to be vulnerable, provides space to be authentic, provides a space to be showing up exactly the way you need to at that given time. With the non-expectation of who you were needing to be. Like I find sometimes with certain individuals, it's like, oh, this is what you should be doing, or this is what you can be doing. And when you're able to exist in a community of like, how are you today? What's going on for you in this exact moment and being present, it provides that your heart just open up just a little bit to be seen in a safe container. And when that container is done, you could just kind of put that back to where it needs to exist and moving back or moving through those patterned just um just through like there's life events and daily routines. So community for me is the epitome of grief processing. The tendency for us to isolate and retract is one of the top. It's one of the top symptoms of grief. It's one of the top like consequences of hate, feeling that grief and loss. So to be able to exist still in that pain or still in that sadness, still in that anger, but connected with people, it makes that step a little bit closer. It makes that welcoming a little bit more wholesome and that connection more a bit more genuine for your own being.
Mhm.
Jody, did you want to speak to community and what we have planned to help folks with that with that with the opportunity to sit in community while being able to honor the pain and the loss at the same time?
Yeah, I just think, with still standing retreats, we are going to be creating this space for people to come and we're going to meet you where you're at, right? And so it's how do we honor where you are, um, provide hope within that community that things can shift for you if that's what you're desiring, and really an opportunity for you to be held and taken care of, because grieving, it's hard work, it is exhausting, and especially if we're holding up that mask, it is incredibly debilitating. And so just to feel a sense of being held, being honored, being supported in a way that will help rejuvenate a little part of your spirit in order for you to go back and face the realities that you come with. So I'll throw it back over to you, Kendra. I know you've got some slides to pop up and a little bit of information there.
Yeah, so as Jody said, we're planning this grief retreat called Still Standing Grief Retreat. And uh, I think I need to give you all a little bit of a story very quickly around why we call this Still Standing Grief Retreat. When I was a kid, I was not the easiest. And I was a small, but I was really little. I was about 3 years old. My parents were saying that wasn't behaving, and they wanted me to sit in a chair in the corner. And I kept standing up, and they said, you have to sit down. Eventually, I did sit, but as they're walking away, they heard, I'm still standing. I'm standing on the inside, but I'm sitting on the outside. And that story has been told to me again and again and again as I've grown up, but it's become part of my understanding of what that little fire is inside of all of us that kind of keeps us going through the hard things. And um, even when we look like we're sitting on the outside, or we need to sit on the outside, there is a part of us that has the will to stand on the inside. And that's what these conversations are about. It's about helping us to access that will. And that's what this retreat is about. So the retreat is from April 3rd to 6th. It's in Calabogie, Ontario. It's at this beautiful lodge that has been used for movies and featured in magazines. It's a very nice place. And our team of wellness providers will guide you through gentle workshops and open discussions and peaceful outdoor activities. Jody and Keegan are amongst the team of supports that we will have there. And we've made sure that every detail is part of the experience, from nutritious meals and cozy accommodations. Everything is taken care of. And we want to know that that you're we know that grief can be overwhelming, so we want to know that we're there to offer some support and a safe space, a place where you can kind of detach from the routine of life, so that we can maybe reprogram, reset if we need to, and get some of that fire back, so that we can stand in the way that we want to be standing.